Hi, LifeGroup leaders. Today I get to bring the lesson preview for Lesson 8. And it's in this lesson we jump into 2 Kings for 6 weeks. And I think it's going to be a good study. Of course, most people recognize that 2 Kings was written by Jeremiah. And basically it continues the decline and fall of the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. Something interesting in 2 Kings, if you remember, in fact, if you read the first few chapters, you'll find that Elijah is carried away by the angels into the presence of God, and Elisha's request that he would get a double portion of his spirit, and that's what happened. And so when we walk through 2 Kings, we find the miracle ministry of Elisha over and over and over again. And I think you'll find that interesting. You can bring that out to your class, maybe even encourage them to do some reading in 2 Kings. Now, one thing I want to bring to you that might help you, and I don't know if you want to share this with your class or not, but when you look at this period of time, you find, perhaps even called the age of the prophets, you find different prophets in the Old Testament preaching. For example, in the North Kingdom, you find Amos and Hosea. And so that's important when you read those chapters and read those books, who the prophet and where they're speaking. In the southern kingdom of Judah, you have all of these different prophets: Obadiah, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah. And so that's why I said it might just be called the age of the prophets, but when you read those books, you realize who they're speaking to, and that's important. However, sadly, back then, as it is today, people really do not want to hear, listen, or obey biblical truth. And that's sad. That could, by the way, that could be a discussion point for you leading into your lesson, okay? Let me share something personal with you. As I've grown up and lived in church, and then finally, became a pastor, and in the later years of my pastoral ministry, and now in the transition part that I'm in now, it just seems that God has impressed upon me more and more the providence of God, what the providence of God is. And I'm going to bring that out, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Now, if you've grown up in church, you may be familiar with today's story. Some have called it the case of the leper. And frankly, most of the times that I've heard preachers preach on the passage or teachers teach on the passage, the emphasis has been on this valiant warrior, and certainly he's a great part of the story. But if we just focus on that, I think we're going to miss the heart of the message. And so here's how I'm going to teach it. I'm going to talk, first of all, about the main lesson, which I believe is the providence of God and what that is. And then I'm going to unfold the characters, much like a play, and talk a little bit about them. I'm going to talk about their role in the different parts of the drama. And then at the end, I'm going to give some takeaways that perhaps can be good discussion points for our class. I think it will. And maybe for you, it might help, okay? Well, I'm going to begin, since I believe the main lesson is the providence of God, I'm going to begin with a question. And I'm going to ask my class, what is God's providence? And here's what my definition is. By the way, good discussion point. Here's what my definition is going to be. The providence of God is God working His sovereignty, working His sovereign will out in real time, circumstances observed for His glory. So the providence of God is the sovereignty of God at work in real time through circumstances for His glory. Now, I'm going to dig a little deeper with my class. I'm going to say this to them, and it may cause them to look at me for a moment. Sovereignty really does nothing. Sovereignty is who God is. It's His rule. It's His ownership. It's His position. It's His right and power. He's sitting on the throne. But God is not a passive God. There are those who believe that when God created the world, He just sat on the throne and now He's observing what's going on and He lets it just run on. Well, God is not a passive God. God is an active God. He's observing and actively working all things to His glory according to His will. From the big to the little, God is an active God. Now, sometimes we say it this way: God is dynamic, not stagnant. So the providence of God is how and when and why sovereignty is working itself out in real time. And I want to stress to my class real time, because it's His design and purpose at work. And hopefully that might help us understand what's going on. When we read this text and this story, we realize God is actively involved in it. He sets up all the characters. And if He's active then, He's active today because He never changes. And so all of the activities and all the things that's going on in our world today is a result of an active God at work for His glory, bringing things purposely to a conclusion. John Piper, a preacher and writer today, calls it this way: purposeful action, providing for and sustaining and governing the world by God. It's Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. And so with that definition, then I'm going to go to the scriptures and I'm going to read 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. And then I'm going to start discussing the characters just a little bit. Number one, we have Naaman. He's a valiant warrior. He's a great part of the story, of course. A valiant warrior, a great man, highly respected, but he was sick. Now, most translations tell us that he was a leper. However, there are some theologians today that think he just had a very bad skin disease, maybe like psoriasis or eczema, something along those lines. The word literally means a scourge or a lesion. And so we're not sure, whatever it was significant enough and a problem enough in his life that when he heard how he could be cleansed, he was willing to go to the king and request absence and travel a lot of distance, okay? There's something else I think that's important about Naaman. I think he was a man of great pride and perhaps even arrogance. Verse 11 tells us he was furious that Elisha didn't even come and meet him. In fact, just sent a messenger. In fact, he was upset that he said, we just call upon God and heal him. And he didn't even come out to do that. And even the messenger, if you think about it, had the audacity to have him dip in the Jordan 7 times. And so I think we can see in Naaman a lot of pride and a lot of arrogance and how that can block the blessing of God. And yet when he did obey, he was humbled and he acknowledged Almighty God. In fact, I think he became converted. That could be a good point of discussion for your class. Look at verse 17. Seems to me that when he acknowledged God and how he wanted a piece of the dirt to carry back with him, it seems to me that he became a converted guy. And so you want to dwell certainly on Naaman, okay? But be sure you bring out the before God and the after God of his life, okay? Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the little girl. And let's don't forget that this young lady was a captive. And she was caring for and ministering to a rugged man and his wife. She could have become bitter. She may have been bitter because she was snatched away from her homeland. Maybe she was thinking, this is payback. Now, what's interesting is we don't even know her name. And yet she cared for and ministered to her rugged leader and his wife. She believed in God. And this young unknown lady accepted the will of God and accepted her position in life. And I think that's pretty significant. And don't forget, if she had not been placed there in God's providence, this story may not have even happened. And so there's God at work here, okay? The third thing I'm going to touch on briefly is the distraught king. He shows no spiritual thought, shows no faith in God. Didn't even think about the prophet of God. He did what most people do today. In fear, he panics. And I'm going to bring out that as believers, we don't need to live in fear, even if we see some things in our nation shaking just a little bit. We can have faith and trust that God knows what's going on, and he's actively causing things to happen as he desires. Number 4, again, I'm going to touch just a moment on the servants. Let's don't miss Naaman's servants who had the boldness and compassion to approach their captain. In a culture, that was a big deal. You didn't do that. But God used them to accomplish, according to his providence, a great act and get glory. So touch on the servants. And then I'm going to finish, of course, with Elisha. I'm going to save him last because I think that he's just a little actor in the story. He simply was a messenger who carried out God's desire and God's will, and that's all. Now, I know that without him, the story never happens. But he's not the main character. God is. In fact, it's kind of amazing to me. Here's a little girl who has no name, who is basically a nothing. And we have a prophet whose name we do know, who's really a something. But both of them are used by God in the same way. And I tell you, life group leaders, I think that's a good teaching point for you, okay? Now, when I'm through with all of that, I'm just going to kind of summarize it all up a little bit. I'm going to give about 5 different takeaways. Number 1, I'm going to say that God is always at work, whether it's through believers or non-believers, to accomplish his will for his glory. Verses 8 and verse 15, read those verses. There is a prophet of God. There is a God. So this whole story is God at work so that he might be glorified, okay? Number 2, I think an important point is that God uses the weak and the mighty to accomplish his will. Don't forget that nobody is small in the eyes of God. Now, if I have time, I'm going to go to Matthew chapter 6 and read a few verses there, beginning at verse 25. And it's simply Jesus is talking about if God takes care of the birds of the air, he'll take care of you. Aren't you much more important than them? And so that you can use that for that second point if you want a biblical illustration. Number 3, I think this is important, that desperation drives people. Naaman was desperate. He was a desperate man, willing to do whatever it took. And I think for us as believers, we need to be sensitive and looking for opportunities to minister to others who are being driven in their desperation. And what a beautiful ministry we could have. People that are desperate will do most anything. And sometimes that opens an opportunity for the gospel. 4th thing is this: when God grabs a man, even though he may be full of arrogance and pride, when God grabs a soul, it'll always give way to humility and praise. And you might want to think about that. And then finally, number 5, I'm going to say that all people the great and small, are in subjection to God. Don't forget that God is bigger than people, and God is bigger than our problems. He's on his throne. He's sovereign. He's working out his purpose. That's called his providence, all to a great conclusion for his honor and his glory, and everybody, whether big or small, live in subjection to our great God. Well, that's kind of how I'm going to unfold the lesson. You may want to use this, may not, but I think it's a wonderful, wonderful story. One of the things I like about the historical books is the great stories that are involved. And this is one of those great stories that you can use to help your students realize they can trust in God. Well, that's my lesson. I hope you have a great week. Thank you for ministering to your flock. You're the shepherds. And don't forget the privilege of that, but also the obligation you have and the responsibility you have to your people. Okay? Let me encourage you to be in prayer for all the activities we've got going on. We have a lot of trips going on. We have camp for the kids coming up. But we also have some sickness in our church. And as you hear about different ones, then lift them up. Take them to the throne of grace. God bless you. See you Sunday.